What is going on, gunfighters? You've probably heard the 223 compared to the 7.62 by 39, compared to the 308. But the 5.56 223 versus the 357 Magnum, yeah, that's what we're going to talk about today. Why would we compare such apple and oranges cartridges? Well, stick around and find out. Welcome to Gunfighter Life, where we talk about guns, gunfighting, defense, hunting, survival, ballistics, the right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. I am blessed to serve you as host. I'll put in a short bio to know why you might want to put any stock into the opinions that I have formulated on this. And we'll get into the main topic. I'll roll into a quick abbreviated bio and then into the main topic. First and foremost, I am a Christian. I don't apologize for that. God is number one in my life. I grew up hunting and fishing in the backwoods of the southeastern United States at a very early age. Some of my earliest memories are with firearms. I joined the Marine Corps at 17, did a couple of combat tours in Iraq. By God's grace, He got me through that safely. After that, I served as an instructor, an urban warfare instructor and a desert warfare instructor for the United States Marine Corps. I also served with the LAPD, both full-time as a sworn police officer and in some more specialized assignments, as well as serving in the U.S. Army, full-time and part-time National Guard. I've been a FBI firearms instructor, still am an FBI firearms instructor, have been for a lot of years, also NRA certified and some other three-letter government agency certified. I've been a private contractor for a three-letter government agency I won't specify. I've been the commander of a tactical team in a large metropolitan area. By God's grace, He got me through all that in one piece, not because I'm better, but because He chose to have grace and mercy on me. I've been a professional hunter and guide. Professionally hunted things like buffalo and elk. Not many people today can say they've done that, but I'm blessed to be able to say that I have. I've hunted everything from white-tailed deer on the East Coast to mule deer on the West Coast to gray squirrel on the East Coast to prairie dog on the West Coast and elk and bear and wolf and slain all manner of beast. A state rifle and pistol champion a few times over in a few different disciplines. Now those experiences, it's not because I'm bigger or badder, certainly not bigger. In fact, I met one of the patrons in real life and he said something to the effect of, "I thought you'd be bigger." Reminded me of that William Wallace movie where he's like, "Oh yeah, if William Wallace were here, he'd shoot lightning bolts out of his rear end." Well, I'm not William Wallace, but I am the person that did all those things in the bio. But not because I'm bigger or badder. I don't think that I survived when many other young, good men did not. I give all the glory and all the credit to God, all the talents and experiences that He's given me and the things that He's let me live through. I hope to use them to glorify God and to help you today. So if I boast in anything, it's not in my strength, it's in that God had mercy on me and saved me because He had a purpose for me. And hopefully I can use those talents, skills, and abilities to serve you today. So why would we go through the folly, some might say, of comparing the 223 to the 357 Magnum? It's a good question. And here's why. The subtitle of Gunfighter Life is Survival Guns. And these two often crop up when you say, "What's your one gun for the apocalypse? For your bug out? For the end of the world as we know it, man?" So let's get a little apocalyptic in our thought process today. Let's think about this in this thought experiment as if we are looking at one of these for our one long gun for the end of the world as we know it. Now, if you've listened for any length of time, if this is not your first rodeo, if you've listened for a long time, you probably know that my go-to long gun is not either one of these. Neither one of these would be my first or my second choice. But this is not about me. These often come up in the discussion of, what about this for your one gun facing off in the apocalypse? When the peanut butter and chocolate hits the fan. So, a lot of people might be looking at both of these, and so I thought we'd talk about that today. Now, I'm not going to really get into the history of these cartridges. I've done whole episodes on just a single cartridge. You might want to go back and look at that. If you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of each cartridge, this is more of a comparison. Now, the AR, America's Rifle, which actually stands for Armalite Rifle, was scaled down from a rifle I believe Stoner designed as a hunting rifle, which was much more powerful than 308, to be scaled down for the military at their request into the 5.56 or the 223. I'm not going to get into the difference of the variants of those. Just make sure your rifle can shoot the ammo that you bought for it. If you injure yourself or somebody else with a firearm, it's your fault, not my fault. Did I miss my calling as a lawyer? Anyway, we live in such a litigious society. This was a scaled down version. The entire reason for this cartridge was to go from a full powered rifle cartridge to a lesser powered rifle cartridge to carry more ammo. Right? Nobody will argue that this is less effective. Well, somebody probably would argue, but most people wouldn't argue that this is a much less powerful round and therefore less punch, less power, whatever you want to put it, than the round that it replaced, the 7.62 by 51 NATO or 308. It was designed to carry a lot of ammo, and it has become America's Rifle. It is one of the most popular, if not the most popular, and I don't know how you'd break that down because there are so many different models of AR-15, M16, M4, civilian clones, but if you consider all those one model, it's probably the most popular model in America. And it's what our military currently uses, all branches, until it gets replaced, if it does get replaced, by the M5, M7. But for right now, and since the 60s, it has kind of been the bread and butter of our military. And generally what the military adopts, at least in the long term, does well in the civilian market. So it is the big player. It is the one to beat. And that's a big reason why it has been on the battlefield, and it's served our soldiers, our Marines, and others too, but soldiers and Marines are the big, bulk of the war fighters for a long time. And it's well established in that role, in the battlefield role. It is the battlefield cartridge of the last several decades for America. Now, the 357 Magnum is very, very different, about as different as you could get. It's designed as a handgun cartridge, designed to be a powerful handgun hunting cartridge, law enforcement cartridge, and a revolver, but also can be chambered in long guns, which is the purpose of our discussion today, but was designed for a completely different purpose. It's a pistol round. And that is one of the big reasons that people look at it for. I'm grabbing my one gun for the apocalypse. And this is a big selling point for many, is that I can have a handgun and a long gun in the same cartridge. Now, it's not the only cartridge that'll do this. You could do this in 9mm. You could do this in, 44 Magnum. You could do it in old school 44-40. But 357 Magnum is arguably one of the best choices, if not the best choice for this, because you could have a decent fighting revolver and a generally lever action carbine in 357 Magnum. When you go from that pistol to the carbine, you're generally going to get quite a bit better ballistics as far as power goes. Now, here's a big caveat that a lot of people, I think, don't consider. Most of these expanding hollow point rounds are designed for handgun velocities. There is a directly inverse relationship when it comes to penetration and expansion. The more that a projectile expands, the more you increase its diameter, the less it penetrates. You may get to a point with the 357 Magnum, if you're using a hollow point in a carbine, that it actually expands too quickly, therefore does not penetrate as well. And you need a certain degree of penetration to be effective. So you really have to do your due diligence. That's something I don't think a lot of people look enough at. They're like, oh, I'm going to carry a Spear Gold Dot, which is a great round, in my 357 Magnum handgun, and then I'm going to carry the same thing in my carbine. Great in the handgun, maybe not so much in the carbine. Probably not very good for a hunting round either. But if you're judicious about your ammo selection, let's say you're shooting like a semi-jacketed soft point in a 357 in a carbine, that's kind of a classic standby, 150 grain, 158 grain semi-jacketed soft point, it'd do well. Or if you're casting your own, which is one of the big advantages, talking about the end of the world as we know it, we'll get to later, 180 grain, like hard cast, semi-wad cutter. I would say not the best for a handgun defensive round, but really good out of a carbine, which kind of cuts down on some of the interchangeability there, because yeah, the rounds may fire, but you're really suboptimal, because a really good, in my opinion, like medium game hunting, which a lever action 357 Magnum carbine can be a great medium game hunting cartridge at moderate ranges. But you got to be judicious about your ammo selection. And the 357 Magnum in a, let's say, 4 to 6 inch revolver is a really good, as far as handguns go, effective round. Caveat with good ammo selection. Those ammo selections are probably not the same. So your interchangeability there, it's more, I think, good in theory than in practice, but it's still there. And obviously, if you had to use those hunting rounds in your handgun because you ran out of your handgun loads, it would interchange. The other big advantage that people would say is that you can also shoot 38 Special, which is a big advantage for both the revolvers and the lever actions. These are manual transmission guns, meaning you go from shooting one round to shooting the next round by your physical biomechanics of your body. You chamber the next round. You spin the cylinder, or you move the lever to, get another round in there. You do that manually. So the operation of the firearm is not dependent on a certain consistency of the ammo. And that is why you can, as long as it'll feed, you can shoot 357 and 38 Special out of the same gun. And that's a bit of flexibility there. Also, you can go from really pedestrian, plain vanilla loads to crazy spicy loads in either a revolver, as long as the revolver will take it, or the lever action. Right? So you can go from really powder puff loads to really, really hot. You could go from literally 110 grain 38 Special loads that barely have enough power so that the bullet goes an inch out of the barrel and drops to the ground. Now, you wouldn't want to do that, but my point is, if you could do that, as long as the bullet would exit the barrel, that gun would work okay. The gun would continue to function. Or you could go to the hottest you could possibly load without blowing the gun up or splitting your brass or something. You could go super hot with 180 grain hard cast. And the gun should function the same amount of reliability, unless there's some weird thing going on with your primer seating or something weird, bulging primers or something, but it should theoretically work just as well. You can't say the same for a semi-automatic firearm. So you get a lot of flexibility there. Why might you want to do this? Well, less recoil for training rounds is one. Another one is for hunting. You may not always be hunting that medium game, right? You're not sport hunting for that nice 8-point buck. If you come across small game and you actually want to eat it, you're not just a serial killer out there trying to kill everything, but you want to shoot something to eat it. You shoot, let's say a sage grouse. I'm out in the Wild West. You shoot a sage grouse with let's say a really mild loaded, solid, non-expanding 38 Special. It's good to go. You're not going to destroy a lot of it. You shoot that same animal with going back to that 5.56, you'd probably kill it, but the whole point of you shooting it is nutrition. So a lot more flexible there, and you can go up, and you could debate this, and I know there are plenty of people that hunt deer with a 223, and I've guided and I've taken people that have hunted deer with a 223. It can be done. It's not great at it. Inside 100, let's say 125 yards, I actually think the 357 Magnum out of a carbine is a better deer hunting round if you're really judicious about your shot placement and your bullet construction. That's a big one. But let's say, 180 grain hard cast, I think that's a better medium game round than the 223 5.56. And I know both will work, but I think it's better for that. So you can go all the way from that up into, even if you keep it realistic and keep it in realistic ranges and really picky about your shot angle and the right bullet selection. People have taken elk with a 357 Magnum out of a handgun. It's better if you have proper bullet construction out of a rifle or out of a carbine. So you can certainly even move up to elk, which in all but the most dire of survival situations where I was going to starve to death if I didn't take the shot, I would not want to take that shot with a 223. So it's vastly more flexible. That is a big advantage, bigger to me than the ammo compatibility between rifle and handgun, because I would rather have the best tool for the job in the rifle and the handgun. So I think, to me, that's my big selling point on the 357 versus the 223. I'm not saying I would choose it over it. I'm just saying that, to me, would be the biggest selling point. And that flexibility of 38 special, really mild to really hot 357 Magnum. That said, even here, a little bit of this is better in like fantasy than in reality, because your rounds are probably not going to shoot in the same place. Now, if you go back to talk about that grouse, if you have your rifle sighted in for your 180 grain hard cast, and you see a grouse and your gun zeroes for 50 yards, let's say, which is a good zero, 50 yards within 180 grain, and you see a grouse at 5 yards or 10 yards, probably the point of aim, point of impact shift at 10 yards is not a big deal. But you get to farther distances, your point of aim, point of impact could be drastically off between a powder puff 38 and a hot Magnum 357, both in a handgun and a rifle. So your interchangeability there, better in theory than in actual practice, but it is a thing. Same with your handgun. Again, if you're talking about contact shot distance, the point of aim, point of impact shift is a moot point. But if you're like, oh, I've ran out of ammo for my handgun and I'm going to load it with my rifle ammo, which is different, are you going to hit what you're aiming at? So be real about this stuff. Don't just think because it theoretically could work out that it actually is going to do what you want it to do. Your other, perhaps, big selling point, if you're really talking about, and this is like a hardcore apocalypse, like not a halfway collapse, like it's the end of the world as we know it. The longer you get into this apocalypse scenario, the harder ammo is going to be to get and find. Here's the thing. 38 Special can be loaded with black powder. And if you know what you're doing, you can make your own black powder, and you can make your own primers, and you can cast your own lead. And lead is used in a lot of applications other than just bullets. If we're talking about a post-apocalyptic world, car batteries have lead, wheel weights have lead, old piping and stuff has lead. So lead's not actually that hard to get. And I forget, but I've heard that Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett on their long hunts would actually, just in the surrounding area, which the Wild West back then was like the Kentucky, kind of Tennessee area. That was the Wild West for them. They were able to find the ingredients and make black powder. So I would encourage you to learn how to do that before the apocalypse, but it's certainly possible. And I'm not going to run afoul of the ACF and tell you how to reuse and make your own primers, but it's not rocket science. It's pretty simple. So the longer this apocalypse goes, if you really think it's going to be that bad and this is your one gun, then that's an advantage. It's going to get dirty faster. Black powder is corrosive. You're really going to have to stay on your maintenance and clean your gun a lot. But talking about that manual transmission, as long as you don't shoot a super high round count and clean your gun judiciously, there's no reason that either one of the revolver or the lever action wouldn't function okay. The velocities aren't going to be as high or whatever, but it's going to function okay and be fairly effective with black powder reloads that you made yourself. and you can reuse the brass over and over again. So that, in theory, you're talking about a long apocalypse, but you can make your own ammo. Now, you could theoretically like reload a 223 with black powder, and you might get 1 or 2 shots off, but that system was not designed for black powder, and it requires a certain amount of pressure and fairly clean gas to operate that mechanism. So you can't really do the same thing with doing that. Also, the velocity is way too high. You can't just cast 5.56 223 bullets out of lead and expect it to work. It'll probably do something, but maybe not what you intended it to do. Probably not very effective. So that said, that is another big advantage. So why would anybody choose the 5.56? Well, again, it is the battlefield implement of our time. Right? And this is the big strength of the 5.56. It is a better battlefield weapon. What do you envision your version of the apocalypse to look like? If it's a battlefield, the clear winner is the 5.56 and an AR and a SCAR 16. If you don't like direct impingement guns, get a SCAR 16 or something similar. Now, there's a lot of, get a Mini 14. There's a lot of guns that aren't direct impingement, that aren't ARs, that aren't as finicky, that are chambered in 5.56. Get the Beretta, the ARX 100. Great gun. And firepower, right? Firepower and maneuverability. Firepower and mobility. You're going to be able to carry a lot more ammo with 5.56. It weighs less. Also, the amount of sheer firepower that one can lay down is not even close between a lever action 357 and a box magazine fed shoulder-fired semi-automatic, let's say plain Jane vanilla Colt LE 6920 M4 semi-auto clone. It's not even close. If you've got multiple adversaries on a battlefield, or that guy's hiding behind car doors, or you've got several adversaries at different distances, one guy's at 20 yards, one guy's at 50 yards, and one guy's at 250 yards, you got a lot longer point-blank range, you got a lot higher rate of fire, you've got a lot more ammo before you have to reload with a 5.56. So it's not going to go toe-to-toe with it. If you think it is, you kind of have a fantasy going on in your mind. Could you, through superior field craft and use of cover and concealment and, staging the arena in your favor, come out on top with a 357? Yes. But you could do that because you had superior field craft and warrior skills, not because the weapon was better. So don't pretend that it's just as good as. It's not. It's not just as good as on a battlefield as a 5.56. Is there any Army, Marine Corps, fighting force in the world in the past 100 years or ever that has armed their troops with lever action 357s? No. And hopefully they never would, because it would be a severe handicap on a battlefield. You could make the argument 308 versus 5.56 on a battlefield, but you're not making the argument that a lever action 357 is just as good as, in a battlefield type scenario, as a 5.56 semi-automatic box magazine fed. It's not. It's not that. So that said, if you're picturing like more of a battlefield, more of a World War III or Civil War type scenario, you are severely, severely handicapping yourself with the 357 Magnum. It's more flexible, arguably a better hunting tool, which you have to feed yourself too, but it is nowhere near as good a battlefield weapon. We mentioned it briefly, but I'll go back to your max point blank range is going to be a lot more, which means that, let's say you're aiming center of chest on a human target, you're going to be able to hit that human somewhere at a much greater range, let's say 300 meters, 300 yards, with a 5.56, where you're talking maybe 120, 150 yards. If you really get creative with your zero, maybe a little bit further, but it's not close. It's not even close. And if, again, you've got multiple targets in a gunfight, you're not going to be out there with your laser rangefinder, you're ranging targets. You're going to be shooting at targets that are shooting at you, and your longer point-blank range is really going to be important. So that is a big advantage, right? That's the reason we went to Spitzer bullets way back in the turn of the last century. And to start wrapping this up, I will give you some numbers. On this. Again, it's kind of apples and oranges. And before I get into actual ballistics of both of these rounds, another advantage people would tout is if you're scavenging for ammo in this, or gleaning ammo, battlefield pickups of ammo from your adversaries, from whoever, or you're getting a last, supply train of ammo, military, law enforcement, NATO, right? The 5.56 is a mainstay for that. Right? Until it's replaced by the 227 Fury, if it ever is, on the mainline infantry, the 5.56 is the current issue of our military. It's used by most law enforcement agencies at this point. It's used by NATO. So if you are expecting a battlefield, unless you find that one dude that chose the other one, you're probably not coming across a lot of 357 Magnum in that scenario. But again, it's kind of the mainstay for military law enforcement for their rifles and carbines at this point. And that may change in the future, but probably not by the time you listen to this podcast. With that, let's go to some real-world numbers. Now, this is from Cartridges of the World. Your numbers may vary, but this is Cartridges of the World. It was a gift from a patron. Thank you, Pat. All right, this list, this is a civilian loading. It's 223, but it's a 62 grain, pretty close to a military loading. This is listed as a fusion, but this lists a 62 grain bullet at even 3,000 feet a second. So that's a pretty easy number to remember. 62 grain, which is the military standard for right now, at 3,000 feet a second. One of the older ones, and really common on the civilian market here in America, is the 55 grain bullet. And it lists two different loadings at 3,200 feet a second. And again, this is going to vary. These numbers are variable, right? It depends on your barrel, your gun, the temperature outside, the humidity, your elevation, all that stuff. These are rough numbers. Let's look at the 357 Magnum. It lists that 180 grain that I talked about. Now, this is a jacketed hollow point, so maybe different numbers when you talk about cast lead. But you're talking 180 grain at 1,090 feet a second. Again, we're comparing apples to oranges. You're talking about a 62 grain on the heavy end at 3,000. I know you can get heavier than that, but 62 grain at 3,000. This is 180 grain, so a way heavier bullet, but at 1/3 the velocity. So it's kind of weird how it's almost 3 times the weight, right? Because 62, if we round that to 60, 3 times 60 would be 180. So 3 times the weight, but it's a little over 1,000 feet a second, but 1/3 the velocity. So you're talking about 3 times heavier projectile, but at 1/3 of the velocity, versus your 62 grain, which is 1/3 the weight, but 3 times as fast. Kind of funny how that works out. And foot-pounds of energy are not always the whole story, because remember, force equals mass times velocity squared. So the energy numbers generally favor velocity. Your energy on this load given here in this data is 475 foot-pounds. And that is pretty hot for a handgun. That 62 grain at 3,000 feet a second, energy is 1239. 470 something versus 1239. Again, apples and oranges. The firepower equation is not even close. But we go back to that flexibility. We talked about 357 Magnum and 180 grain. Let's look at a 38 Special. And you could load lighter than this, but it lists 110 grain at 1,000 feet a second for 244 foot-pounds of energy. Again, if you talk about flexibility, the 357 38 Special combos kind of got that. And since I mentioned it briefly, if you are, and I mentioned the bio, I've been a guide, I've done a lot of hunting. If you are going to hunt medium-sized game with a 223, if you absolutely had to, at 2024, I would probably pick a solid copper monolithic bullet. They penetrate pretty well. If you're on a marginal caliber, which I certainly would consider 223 marginal for deer at best, you might look at a solid copper for that, and or a much heavier kind of bonded bullet on the heavier end of the spectrum. Just a brief caveat there. But I guess the main thing on this is, what attributes are best for you? There's no one best cartridge. If there was, we would just have one rifle cartridge, one pistol cartridge, one shotgun gauge. Do you want a really good, today's standard for battlefield cartridges, or do you want a more flexible cartridge? What are you looking for? And because people come at it in different ways, again, these are two of the recommendations or two of the suggestions that come up as, the peanut butter and chocolate has hit the fan and I got to grab one gun. Some people will say lever action 357, and some will say give me my Daniel Defense or pick your brand AR-15 with an LPVO or a red dot. And I don't see the future. I don't know what the apocalypse is going to be like. Is it going to be a civil war, World War III? Is it going to be a famine or an actual pandemic that wipes out, a large chunk of the population really quickly? I don't know the answer to that. I don't see the future. I don't pretend to. Okay. I guess in summation, what attributes or what scenario are you envisioning or you consider likely? That would kind of sway you as to what characteristics you were looking for. Because these are, again, apples and oranges kind of comparison. Although there's a lot of people that would pick either one of these for your one long gun for the end of the world as we know it. Hopefully you like these curious comparisons. I know the ballistics themselves are kind of apples and oranges, but the scenario in which you might grab these, is kind of interesting. It's an interesting comparison, is what I'm trying to say. And with that, your tactical tip of the day. For those of you that thought that I forgot it, talking about the flexibility of the 357-38 Special. There are quasi shot shells for these. There are factory loads. You can load your own. You can actually buy the shot capsules, or you can buy preloaded. I think it's CCI that makes them. It's been a long time since I've had them, but they make multiple projectile loads. They make larger shot and smaller shot, and if you load your own, you could pretty much pick whatever shot size you want that would fit in there. So you could, and it's not as effective as even close to as effective as like a 410 shotgun, but it does give you a multiple projectile option if you wanted a really close in, really small game, really short range. And you got to experiment with these, because I've heard that sometimes they don't even exit out of the shot capsule. But assuming they somewhat work and you got to test this, that aids even more flexibility. If you didn't know about those, that's your tactical tip of the day. Your tactical verse of the day. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord shall not impugn sin. It's a beautiful, beautiful verse. With that, men, thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.